Last week, I offered a little anecdote about how I wasn't the biggest fan of the kid that I used to be when I was in elementary and middle school. And I think it kind of segued well into the topic of regret. I think it did its job well. It was good. But this week, there's no clever way for me to introduce this subject. There's just not. We're in the midst of a sermon series called The Tough Stuff. For the past few weeks, we've been in this sermon series, and it's a series where we uncover certain topics that are maybe taboo, difficult, uncomfortable, but they relate to our faith, and we uncover them and equip ourselves to address them faithfully from the perspective of our faith. So we've addressed topics like recurring shameful sin, how to address an unbelieving spouse, and last week we talked about regret. And we've reached the last week in this sermon series, and as is fitting for any grand finale, we've reached the most uncomfortable, the most difficult, definitely the most taboo of any subject that could possibly be put into this category. And that is church hurt. Of course they gave that to the vicar. Of course they gave that to him. Unbelievable. Church hurt. It's the thing that happens when the church, or more specifically, her people, hurt others, cause harm. And it is remarkably evil. It's so uncomfortable. And it actually is different a little bit from every topic we've talked about before. Because if you think about last week, for instance, we talked about regret. Every one of us deals with regret. So it was easy to approach regret because this is something that every single person struggles with. By contrast, very few of us in this room, I would say, I would imagine, very few of us have been the victim of church hurt. So, consequently, we have to approach this from two angles. Obviously, we need to approach this from the perspective of the victim. We're never going to leave them out. But we also have to approach this from the uncomfortable perspective of the perpetrator. Because I know many of us would like to think that we've never been the perpetrator of church hurt, but I think the truth will tell us, it'll tell us otherwise. So, my goal for this message, if we're going to be effective and approach church hurt well, my goal is twofold. One, I want us to have a better idea of really what church hurt looks like. And two, I want us to have a framework that we can use to evaluate a ministry so that we can be a little bit more aware of whether or not there is a danger of being in harm's way in this ministry. Whether this church or that church or whatever church is susceptible to church hurt. That's my goal. So when most of us think of church hurt, the first thing that comes to mind, of course, are those horrible, horrible things done by leaders within the church. Pastors, priests, horrible crimes that they've committed that's landed them in jail. And without question, that is church hurt. Undoubtedly, that is church hurt. And even more than that, the failures of the leaders is what's being talked about in our reading from Ezekiel. I told you that there's a unifying theme that unites our two readings from Ezekiel and John, and of course, that is the image of a shepherd and their sheep. And this image has been analogous to the relationship between God and his people for as long as this image has been used, but it's also been analogous to the relationship between the church and her leaders for as long as this image has been used. And so, of course, in Ezekiel, God's not literally talking about shepherds. He's not. He's talking about leaders of his people. And so in this passage, God is saying, hey, leaders of Israel, I've given you authority, but I've also given you basic instructions. And you're not following them. You're not bandaging the wounded. You're not healing the sick. You're not going out seeking and bringing home the lost and wandering sheep. Those are basic jobs the shepherd's responsible for, and you're not doing them. But what are you doing instead? You're taking the authority that I've given you, and you're abusing it, and you're using that authority to violently and harshly domineer over the sheep. So as a result, God says, I'm done. I'm done with you shepherds, And since you can't do this job that I've placed you, I'm going to do it. That's what's so powerful about this passage. God intervenes and he says, I'm going to be the shepherd. I'm going to be the one who looks after my sheep, since clearly you can't do it. And this prophecy, this message from God, is fulfilled in John's gospel when Jesus says, I'm that shepherd. I'm that shepherd that was being told to Ezekiel in Ezekiel 34. I'm that shepherd. And Jesus goes even further to fulfill this prophecy by saying that there's going to be one flock and one shepherd. What does that mean? Well, kind of frustratingly for us, it means that no man is fit to be a leader in God's church. No man is fit for that job. Only God is fit to be a leader in his church. So for our purposes, that kind of raises more questions than it gives answers to. Because the message of this prophecy and of this gospel is that I and our pastoral staff here at St. Mark are on the very same level as pastors and priests who are in prison. And that is absolutely true. I need Jesus just as much as the pastors and priests who are in prison. I am no more sinful than they are. They need Jesus just as much as I do. That's the truth. But that brings us no closer to understanding how we can evaluate the danger that is present with a pastor who might commit church hurt and one that won't. It doesn't bring us any closer to that. And that's where I got stuck when I was writing this sermon, because I sat there and I was reading this prophecy in Ezekiel, and I go, I know I'm not worthy to be here. I know I'm not worthy to be a leader in the church. So then what's the difference between a pastor who will commit church hurt and a pastor that won't? And so after sitting and looking at these readings and praying and thinking about it, I came to the realization that there is one question that you can ask to evaluate a ministry, and it will be incredibly indicative of whether or not there is a danger for church hurt. And that question, very simply, is this: who's in charge? Who's in charge of this church? And there are several potential answers to that question, most of which are red flags, most of which are indicators that you should leave. The first answer, naturally, that might come to our minds instinctually is, well, the guy who's actually the leader in the church, the pastor. And instinctually, you might say, well, isn't the pastor in charge of every church? Doesn't every church have a pastor who's in charge? And I would say, no. In fact, I would argue that there's a distinct difference between churches in which the pastor is in charge and churches where he's not. For instance, many of you may have heard Pastor Matt use language analogous to a shepherd, but he says that he is not the shepherd, he is the under shepherd at this church. And he's not saying that to be like tongue-in-cheek. Matt also says that he's not the senior pastor of this church. And he's not saying that to be a joke or to be facetious. He's saying that because it's true. He knows that he's not in charge, but there are churches, far too many, in fact, where the pastor is the one in charge. And what do those churches look like? To answer that, I would just say, go back to the reading in Ezekiel and look at what those shepherds are doing. Instead of fulfilling their basic tasks of looking after the sheep, they're taking the authority that God has given them and they're using it to domineer over and abuse their flock. A church where the pastor is in charge is a church where the pastor takes the authority that God has given him and uses it to abuse his people. And it's very, very clear to see where churches are like that. There's far too many of them. But this is where it gets kind of uncomfortable. Because while pastors certainly can be the answer to that question, it's not the most frequent wrong answer to that question. Far more often than pastors being in charge of the congregation, an answer that shows up so much more frequently than pastors is the people. Who's in charge of this church? It's the people. Churches, especially in our tradition, are known for having members that dedicate years and years to faithfulness to one congregation. St. Mark itself has numerous people who have been here for more than 4 decades. And churches need people like that. There is no question about that. Churches need people who will show tremendous faithfulness no matter who is sitting in the pews, no matter who's standing on the platform. They show exceptional dedication to this church. But there is a grave danger with that dedication, because the danger is allowing that dedication to devolve into entitlement. This is my church. Don't mess with it. And that can rear its head in a lot of ugly ways that our church hurt. What does that look like? It looks like a stranger walking through those 2 glass doors, and you immediately notice that they are in no way dressed for church. They are completely dressed inappropriately for the sanctuary that they just entered into. In fact, it's so bad that it just outwardly offends you. It's really, really bad. And honestly, it really could be. And so you have to let them know, like, hey, you can't dress like this in here. You have to understand that this is a house of worship. God is here, and that outfit is not respectful to him. It looks like another stranger walking through those glass doors and sitting behind you during confession. And during confession, they lean over and they say something to their neighbor. And of all the times in the worship service, they do that during confession. So you have to turn around and let them know, hey, just so you know, I know you're new here, but this is the most vulnerable part of the service. This is the most vulnerable part of worship, where we all sit and we have to navigate our brokenness. And we have to confess that we're sinful before God. And you're just talking. You can't have that happen. And while those responses are certainly well-intentioned, it's entitlement showing through. This is my church. Don't mess with it. It's uncomfortable, but it's real. And I'm not making this up. Like, for instance, when I was a bartender for the past 3 years, that's me bartending in San Diego, and that's me in St. Louis. Especially when I was a bartender in St. Louis, conversations about faith became almost a nightly occurrence. Almost every time that I showed up for work, I would have a conversation about faith. And here's how that happened. I bartended at a hotel, and so people were traveling. And so more often than not, people would come to find out one way or another that I'm from California. And whether that was because I made them a really good margarita, or I know a lot about tequila, like California people do for some reason, it could be. But they find out, and then their follow-up question naturally is, oh, well, what brought you to St. Louis? And so obviously they expect the answer like, oh, California's terrible, and I wanted to live like a human being deserves to live, where I can afford rent and pay for gas. They would expect an answer like that. And while there's merit to those statements, there's a soft spot in my heart for California, and I tell them, I moved here because I'm actually attending Concordia Seminary here in St. Louis. And they go, oh, great, you're studying to be a priest. That's awesome. And I go, pastor, but, it's okay. And then by that time, the train's left the station, and the conversation's happening, and there is nothing like 1 or 2 drinks that will make people honest about their faith. And that's exactly why I loved these conversations, because they don't care about offending me. I'm not their pastor, I'm their bartender. And so they can say whatever they want to me, especially because they've had honesty elixir. And they do. And so some of those conversations immediately go off the rails, and these people talk about how religion is a disease to society, and society would be so much better off if religion was eradicated entirely. And all you can know about religion and define it by is the mistakes that it's made. Things like the Spanish Inquisition and all the horrible crimes that were committed by priests and pastors in the past. So religion should be done away with entirely. And I've heard people talk like that, and I know that I can't get through to them. So I just let them talk. I make them great drinks, and I wish them a good night. That's fine. But the people that interest me were the ones who used to go to church but stopped. And you'd be surprised how many people share that experience. And anytime a conversation went in that direction, I always wanted to include two questions. Why did you stop? And what's keeping you from going back? And almost unanimously, the answer to that second question, what's keeping you from coming back, is I've tried, but I don't know, it just feels like this club that I'm not a part of, and I can't get in. And I've heard all this stuff about Christianity and how it's so different from all these other religions, where every other religion is this list of rules that if you don't follow it well enough, you're not going to go to heaven and you're not going to be righteous. And Christianity is that one where it's not about how good of a person you are. It's about how good of a person Jesus was supposed to be. But every single time I walk into church, I feel like I'm an outsider and there's this club that I need to follow this list of rules, and only then will I be a part of the club. So I left and I just didn't go back. Say what you will about church not being about how you feel. It's true. Church isn't about how you feel. That's not why we come to church. We don't come to church to feel good. We come to church to receive forgiveness and God's gifts. Say what you will. But those people are never coming back to church. And it's because they left feeling a certain way. And we can't ignore that. We have to address it. That's church hurt. Those people have been hurt by the church in the very same way that anybody else has been hurt by the church. So what are we supposed to do about it? What do we do? Well, I think we ask the question, who's in charge at this church? And we respond by putting the right person in charge. And I'm sure every one of you can guess. The good shepherd is the person we need to put in charge. He's the one who's in charge. When Pastor Matt says he's an under shepherd, he's saying that Jesus is the shepherd. Pastor Matt says he's not the senior pastor. He's saying that Jesus is the senior pastor of St. Mark Lutheran Church in Spring Branch. He says that for a reason. The reason he says that is a church where Jesus is in charge is a church at its best. That's why. Now, we can say that, but what does that look like? Well, it looks like how we treat people. Who was Jesus kind and gentle to? Not everyone. Definitely not everyone. He was not kind and gentle to the Pharisees. He wasn't kind and gentle to those who perceived themselves to be righteous, but he was kind and gentle to who? Prostitutes, tax collectors, outward sinners. That's who he was kind and gentle to. We need to mirror that behavior. So instead, when we see that stranger walk in and they're dressed completely inappropriately, and to be sure, there is an inappropriate way to dress for church. I am not denying that. But instead of the first thing being how appalled you are at how they're dressed, instead make the first thing you say to them how happy you are that they're here. Because I, for one, would 100% rather a poorly dressed person be in here than a perfectly dressed person being out there and not being saved. Treat them with kindness and gentleness. When that stranger walks in and talks in the row behind you, instead of telling them how inappropriate it is that they talked at this very moment, tell them how amazing it is that they're here and how much you want to cook them dinner tonight. Introduce yourself. Tell them your name. Because little did you know, that person may have been a single mother who just wanted to introduce her daughter to Jesus for the first time. And instead of making her leave this church feeling like an audacious nuisance, we make her leave this church reminded that she is a forgiven, loved child of God. That's what church is for. There's a reason before confession every week I say that my goal is to make it so that everybody who walks out that door has no questions whether they are forgiven. That's how we do it. The changes will come in time. Eventually they'll realize that they'll need to dress differently. And there's times to talk and there's times probably to not talk. But start by showing them kindness and gentleness. That's what a church where Jesus is in charge looks like. Last thing, I need to address those who have been hurt by the church. Whether you are sitting here this morning or whether you happen to see this online, please hear me out. I know, especially if you've been hurt by a leader in the church, you might be justifiably hesitant to hear anything that I have to say. And I get that. In fact, some of you may be rolling your eyes at the very prospect of me being the one saying any of this as a person who has a leadership position in this place. I understand. And I'm not here to defend those that hurt you, and I'm especially not here to defend the leaders of the church that hurt you. I'm here to defend you, and I'm here to be your advocate. And as your advocate, I want to tell you two things. The first thing is that what you're feeling is totally justified. You're allowed to feel that way. And while I can not pretend to understand what you're feeling, I can certainly tell you that what you're feeling is right. But the second thing that I need to tell you is that there are so many churches around the world, including this one, that want nothing more than to welcome you, to love you, and to rally around you. The church is what can heal you. And now I know how ridiculous it might sound to propose that the very thing that hurts you could be the thing that brings you healing. I know how ridiculous that sounds. I get it. I'm simply here to suggest that maybe the church that hurts you wasn't the church at its best. Because the church at its best does not look like the church that hurts you. The church at its best does not belittle like the church that hurts you. And the church at its best most certainly does not have leaders like the church that hurts you. The church at its best is a place where the wounded are welcome. Even more than that, the church is a place where everybody gathered in this room, whether they're sitting in the pews or standing on the platform, is ready and willing to acknowledge the fact that we are wounded too. In fact, that's the very reason we come to this place, is that I'm not in charge, you're not in charge, but we come to be healed by the man who is in charge, who was wounded on your behalf because he loves you. That's why we come to church, because church brings healing. And I want to extend an invitation to that church, to you. We're not always going to be the church at our best. But I can certify that we will put Jesus in charge. And he is the one man who can bring you healing. So give church a chance. We will be here. But so much more importantly, he will be here. Amen.